Hello everyone, welcome to our program Books and Authors. I'm your host Terry Kelly, and today we are talking with William Kenley about his book, The Dogs of Luck. Welcome, William.
Thank you, Terry.
Now the title of your book, is it about dogs or is it about luck? Well, it's about both. And when I started to read it, I thought it was going to be this cute, funny little book because it says that it's about comic confessions, and there are confessions in it. And a lot of the book is very funny, and there is a lot of confession in here. So you're talking about things that happened to you during your life, some of which were very funny. But as I was reading it, thinking it was just going to be a lot of laughs, I discovered something. Shakespeare wrote in highfalutin language, and he wrote about universal truths. And your book contains a lot of universal truths, but it's not written in iambic pentameter or anything. So I was kind of surprised at the way this book took a turn. And even though I was laughing through a lot of it, some of it made me want to cry. So it's a very heartfelt book, and I loved it. So it starts off with a story about two dogs. And I think our readers would like to hear that story because it kind of defines what the book is about. So what is that story about the dogs?
The story of the dogs was given to me at a time when I was going through inner turmoil. And a co-worker walked into my office one day, and he gave me this short story, which goes something like this. It takes place in the Southwest on the top of a mesa overlooking the valley, and it's nighttime and the stars above, and it's an old Indian chief and his grandson. And the Indian chief is trying to teach wisdom to his grandson, and he tells this story. He looks down at his grandson and he says, "Grandson, in my belly there are two wild dogs, and they are always fighting. One is the dog of love and acceptance and forgiveness. The other dog is the dog of meanness and hate." And then he didn't talk, and the grandson only heard the wind in his ears. And finally the grandson looked up at the grandfather with those big brown eyes, and he said, "But grandfather, which dog will win?" And the Indian chief looked down at his grandson and said, "Whichever dog I feed." And the importance of that at a time in my life when I was making personal choices many every day, trying to put my life back together, became a mantra for me. And I used it with my children also. I would say, "I don't think you're feeding the right dog." And at some point I knew that they were hearing me because they would look up at me after another incident and say, "I'm not feeding the right dog, am I, Dad?" So it's the same. I used that as I went through the various stories that are in the book. Am I feeding the right dog?
Yes. You know, you said it was very important to you and you used it with your children, but I think it's important for everyone to think about that. And that's one of the things that I meant by universal truths. We can all relate to that, feeding the right dog or the wrong dog. I love the way you described it, and I love the way you worked it into everything that followed. It made me think of something. When people have a difficult upbringing or problems in their early life, they can either become angry at the world and feed that dog of anger and envy, or they can feed the other dog. And I found that in my observation, people who have had some problems in their early life, whether it be poverty or whatever it could be, they go to one extreme or the other. They either become, they really feed that good dog or they really feed the bad dog. So they're either angry at the world and take their anger and loss out on everyone, or they turn the other way and become very compassionate.
And to follow on that, I find that feeding either dog is seductive and addictive, and it's not as though you choose with each incident that comes up. You develop this pattern of response. So if you have formed a pattern of feeding the right dog, you will do that until you consciously make a decision to do something else.
Yeah. It reminds me of a conversation I heard between a father and his young daughter. She was going to make the wrong decision, and he just listened, and finally he said to her, always, always, always do the right thing. He said, that's all I'm going to tell you. And she thought about it, and she looked at me and she said, I changed my mind. So it's the same thing as feeding the right dog.
It's the same thing. My father would say, never do anything that you would not want to appear on the headlines of the paper tomorrow morning.
That's a very good one. And when I was teaching, I remember a class that we took, well, before I started teaching, and the professor said, never say anything to a child that you wouldn't say if his or her parents were standing there. And then when my husband was in the corporate world, all this business about, sexism and everything, and we were just having a conversation about it one day, and I said, well, what I would do if I were you, and I were talking to if I were a male talking to a female employee, I would go by this rule. Don't say anything to her that you wouldn't say in front of her husband.
Mm-hmm. That's good.
So even something like, you look nice today. A
couple of the chapters in The Dogs of Luck talk about that sort of thing, for
Yes.
example.
Yeah. The corporate world and
the
how it
corporate world.
changed and when.
The corporate world in the 1970s and 80s is so different from the corporate world today. I'm still in the corporate world today.
Yeah.
And from things, technological things, cell phones, of course, the computer that's on the desk, to the way that we treated each other. And my first corporate job, I was in an office with 33 other salespeople, and we had 2 or 3 secretaries. And the job of the secretaries was not only to answer the phone, but to type our letters. So I can remember writing a letter, longhand, taking it to her. She would type it out just as I had written it, reading my bad penmanship, give it back to me, and I would change things, and I would move things and draw arrows, and I'd give it back to her, and she would try to make sense out of that, and sometimes that was 4 or 5 iterations, but that was her job.
Yeah.
And now we don't have that. I correct myself on my computer.
Or the computer corrects you.
Or the computer corrects you and makes me not need to think anymore. And then I send it by email, so there's no more fax. And I can remember the first time I saw a fax machine, and they were introducing it at our office. And I thought to myself, why do you need that? If it has to get there quickly, send it by Federal Express. And then the faxes, they came and then they went, and now we do everything by email. So, and then beyond that, on another chapter, is the change, the social change that sort of the inventions and so on bring. Because a sales cycle, for example, I'm a salesman. The sales cycle used to involve perhaps a phone call, then a visit to the customer, and then come back and you prepare with the help of other people in the office, perhaps more seasoned salespeople. You prepare the proposal, you either mail it or take it out, and maybe a month later or 2 months later you'll get an order, on and on and on, the whole sales cycle. Nowadays, in fact, I told this story a couple of years ago, and I said nowadays people will call up on the phone, you will email them a proposal, they'll email you a purchase order, and it ships the same day. So the sales cycle has shrunk like that.
Yeah.
Now they don't even call on the phone, they go to our website, look on our website, order it on our website, and it automatically ships the same day. So the sales cycle has gotten so much smaller. And what are the implications for that? One of the implications is that people don't have this sort of conversation anymore. That's one. Another thing that has happened is that we say things as they occur to our mind, they're out our mouth. Whereas in the olden days, we would talk about it, we would think about it, we would write it down. The second time we wrote it, when we rewrote it after the secretary gave it back to us, then we'll think something slightly different. So our thoughts would mature.
Yes, and be refined.
And be refined. And there is no maturity. There's very little maturity. There's a lot less maturity. How about that?
It's a lot more ballistic thinking rather than.
That's a good phrase, yes.
Yeah, it's just whatever you think, it's out there, and then you say, "Oh, I shouldn't have said
Right,
that."
try to pull it back.
And you mentioned penmanship. Well, this breaks my heart because I love penmanship. I love writing. I love especially Cyrillic. Right? I love writing in Russian. My English is sometimes, my Arabic writing is sometimes hard to read because I still have, having studied Russian, I have the Russian letters in there. And I remember trying to write books on the blackboard in my class, and I wrote, one of the kids raised his hand and said, "What does 6 uksi mean?" Oh, looked okay to me. But penmanship, I think, is so important because graphology is a real science, and you can tell a lot about a person by their handwriting. And so handwriting analysis is no longer practiced. And the younger set can't read cursive. They print everything. And if they try to write, it's atrocious. But I know if you're taking the SATs, they ask you to copy a printed paragraph in your own handwriting because there's so much cheating going on. You can forge someone's name, but you can't forge a paragraph written by someone else. So I think it's always going to be important to be able to write cursive. What do you think? Is that gone forever, or?
It is gone forever, my opinion. And I'm just at the other side of the spectrum from the opinion that you just expressed, because my penmanship is cramped. I'm so used to typing it that when I go back now and I try to do you remember what your first grade teacher, you would do the loops like this on the piece of paper, that 3 lines?
Yeah.
Right?
It was fun, I loved it.
Somehow I lost all that, and so I feel much more comfortable typing than I do writing.
Well, do you ever write a handwritten note to someone, like a thank you note? Or
Yes, thank you notes and birthday cards must be handwritten. Right.
Yes. Well, here's a suggestion. Feed the writing dog. Practice penmanship, because you never know when you'll need it. Right?
That's good.
Yeah. You don't have to, of course, but that's my suggestion. Of course, you deal with much more important things than that in this book, right?
That's not necessarily an unimportant suggestion.
Yeah.
Because if I don't keep trying to learn something or better myself all the time, then I will retreat into my cave and stop growing. So on the way home, sometimes take a different path. And when I do that, I see stores that I never knew were there. I find, I look at things differently. Also, you should be afraid at least once a day. You need to have that fear
That's easy.
once a day.
Fear motivates us. A little bit of fear.
It excites us too.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
So we go for a walk in one of the parks, and perhaps we peek over the edge, or we climb down the front of the rocks, or we do something every day that challenges you. If you find that you're in a rut, you have to get out of that rut, or you'll die.
That's right. Yeah, we have to keep thinking and innovating and changing. And in the beginning of your book, you tell some really hilarious stories. There was a camping story, but it's about kids experimenting with things. And I told you the story of my husband. Well, he told you the story of his camping experience and the can of soup and then the can of tar. And you had an experiment with a can of baked beans that could have caused a lot of trouble, but kids do things like that, and that's how we learn. And then your experiences with a boat, you confronted danger, and I think all kids do that. My cousin and I almost burned down an entire field, but we decided to cook some corn on the cob, and so we built a little fire, because that's what my grandfather used to do on his farm, but there were no trees or vines there. So we started our little bonfire, and the next thing we knew, we heard fire engines, and we were right next to a field, the old folks' home, it was called. And we thought, mistakenly, that we burned down the whole field and killed all the people who lived there. So it was a very horrible day, but then we found out that they burned the grass on purpose. That wasn't our fault.
So you were relating personally to those
To your
chapters,
story.
because fire played a big part in my growing up.
Yes, it did.
And the luck, this is the dogs of luck, the luck that I did not burn down the town of Warren, Pennsylvania, or that I did not burn down that hotel room, or that I did not burn down or cut off or lose one of my limbs is one of the biggest lucks that I have had in my life.
Yes, and every time I read your hilarious but scary stories about the fires, I was remembering my experience with the bonfire and
Yep.
thinking we killed a whole bunch of people and burned down their
At the time, I just thought we were being very resourceful.
Yeah, some of those stories were, well, you were a kid in some of them, but then you were a grown-up in others.
I have to tell you this, Terry. First of all, teenage boys are some of the stupidest creatures on earth.
Well,
And
I
when-
taught high school for about